It's a real honor to be here. I always wanted to give a talk at NYU. I think it's a very cool place, so I'm glad to be here today. Before I come to a conference, I tend to look up words, and here the keywords seem to me identity and encoding. And I thought, well, identity, that's very easy. We use this as a very common word, and if we try to find where it comes from, I thought perhaps Cicero, and then probably he talked about Roman identity or so. And then I tried to look up the etymology of identity, and it set me on a wild goose chase for 2 or 3 days or so. It's actually very difficult and very complicated. We know that there is a Latin word called identitas, and that's very probably first used in the 4th to the 5th century. But I have never found the actual text. All the texts that the encyclopedias and whatnot pointed me to did not seem to have the word, or at least I couldn't find in there. I tried full text searches and so on, the word just wasn't there. We know that it is not part of classical Latin vocabulary. It is a post-classical term. And it's very probably derived from idem, and perhaps influenced by the formation identidem, which means repeatedly, habitually, something that is constantly done. There is also the suggestion that identitas is derived from idem in the same way that essentitas is, another post-classical term, is derived from esse, from being. So, and the OED, of course, says, well, actually, identitas is just a translation for the ancient Greek tautotis, which means identity. But what does identity mean? I put to you for now that the etymology of identity is unclear, and that its first Latin occurrence is unknown. One of the early dictionaries that had the word listed, had an entry for identitas, is the wonderful Charles Dufresne, Sieur de Caen, Glossarium Medii et Infime Latinitatis, which is the glossary, the dictionary of medieval and late Latin, 18th century work, published in the 18th century, but done by Dufresne in the 17th century. Dufresne was a great philologist, a great scholar, and browsing through medieval sources, he gives 3 different meanings for identitas. One is quevis actio repetitia, whatever action is repeated, right, constantly repeated. And then the use of identitas pro idem for the word self, which is not so interested in our context. And then interestingly, he says, deprecated, jus quod domino superiori competere solet, which I tend to read as the privilege or the right that these sort of rulers or nobles in a society, the right that behooves to the rulers within a society, to the powerful. So when we look at this semantic field of traditional identity, what comes up is something like self-sameness, which we are, I think, okay with, but also something that is constituted over time by repeated, habitual action. It's also a privilege for the powerful. Powerful people have identities. And this is quite different, I think, from our everyday use of identity, which is emphasizing difference, right? And this is where Keynotes come in. We tend to use in modern English, especially American English, identity is used as a demarcator of difference rather than of self-sameness. Or I'm the self-person as I was yesterday. Yeah, in a way, but actually I also want to have a creative distinction in there, right? I want to be creative, I want to be new. So identity becomes something to be attained rather than to be settled like dust on you. And it's a natural right. It's not a right that you have because you're powerful. It's a right that everybody has. Don't impinge on my identity, right? And we also, one of the markers of modernity is that identity, we're used to think of identity as a multiplicity, as a plurality rather than a unity. So one single person can have different identities. And in the case, interestingly, in the Michael Field case, we have different person who build one common identity. Right? So all these things are possible in the 20th century, in 21st century, and 19th century already. So I put to you that within the very word identity, we have this ambiguity of sameness and of difference. And that makes it a strong term for the humanities, because the humanities thrive on ambiguity. We love to discover and theorize different interpretations and defend them. And the communication about this ambiguity is modeled especially in literature. And here's an example. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Sometimes when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, I'm going to sleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would try to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands and to blow out the light. I had been thinking all the time, while I was asleep, of what I had just been reading, but my thoughts had run into a channel of their own, until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book. The church, a quartet, the rivalry between François I and Charles V. So here, on the borderline between being awake and asleep, sort of Proust's narrator here, in the very first passage, gives an insight into the evanescence and the fragility of his identity as a person, as an awakened person, and how what he reads in texts sort of seeps into his being. Compare that to encoding. Encoding is a means of sameness. All forms of standardization and measurement have as a primary objective to disambiguate. Digital media disambiguate by their very nature, by bit and byte. The way digital works is you have places that work as either on or off within your computer. Okay? There is no in-between. Perhaps this will change with quantum computing, but with the von Neumann computer, a bit is either on or off. It can't be both at the same time, or neither. Ambiguity, however, always re-enters. Like suffering, it always seeps in again, even when modeled or simulated in a medium that relies on unambiguous distinctions. So the word for, capital F-O-R, in hexadecimal is 4-6, 6F, and 7-2. And in binary, 0-1, 0-0-0, 1-1-0, 0-1-1, 0, 1-1-1-1, 0-1-1-1, 0-0, 1-0. And that is an important standard, namely the ASCII standard. And the ASCII standard is one of the first very powerful encoding standards that we have. The American Standard Code for Information Interchange that was first proposed in 1963. It encoded 128 characters based on the English alphabet. So capitals were encoded, given a code point, and lowercase characters were given a code point, and then the numbers, and then the full stop, and then the comma. Originally, this was done in a 7-bit code, 1963, right? It was already clear that computing software and hardware was probably going to be based on octal numbers rather than on 7-bit systems. But at that time, it was the extra bit that this kind of encoding gained was considered worth the trouble. So it was a transmission trade-off that made the people who put together ASCII settle on a 7-bit and not on an 8-bit standard. Later on, when it became clear that computers would run on octals and hexadecimal rather than on sevens, extra 0 was added on to that to make it work. The real breakthrough for ASCII came in '68 when President Johnson mandated that all computers purchased by the government must support ASCII. Okay, so since then, 4 is this particular set of binaries and not any other. Now that the encoding of English ABC is standardized, what about the other about 180 writing systems that humans have come up with in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years? Enter Unicode. Unicode was first drafted around the same time as TEI, '88. And it was originally planned as a 16-bit specification, which would have given it 65,536 characters to play with. Fortunately, this first spec was not adopted. And by the time the Unicode consortium was formed in '91, some new interesting design ideas had been realized in the way Unicode was built. One is the plain architecture that altogether allows for about 1.4 million code points. That's enough for a couple of generations. Another thing that was very important and ingenious and which worked very well is the separation of code points and encoding. So every code point in this Unicode space can be realized in the computer, the way we communicate with the computer in different forms of encodings. This has proved very useful. In version 9, therefore, from last year, Unicode now contains 128,000 characters for altogether 135 scripts. So we are almost done. 82,000 are Chinese characters, Chinese, Japanese, Korean ideographs. So by far the largest block. All the other 130 languages have only half that number of signs. Now that characters can be represented in the computer, can be disambiguated and encoded in the computer, let's talk about markup. Markup adds further disambiguating information to text files. So by then you already need an encoding like ASCII or Unicode to have a text file. And the first attempts to use markup was because people wanted to print nicely. So it was for the communication with the printer. In the early 70s, Donald Knuth, of course, provided a wonderful markup language called LaTeX. And if you write something in LaTeX like that, then the output should look it should come out like this in the PDF or in the printer. Then we have already heard about HTML. If you add these brackets and the B, then you would expect the output somehow to be boldened. And as Marion and has already emphasized with TEI, with XML, there is no clear there's no clear rule for how something like this should be represented in the output. So this is added by in the transformation stage. If you mark up any particular chunk in your text, you will have to decide how you want to see it in the output, or if you want to see it at all, or rather count it, or do something else with it, analyze it. Peter has already given us an overview of the history of TEI. And I just want to add a couple of things. Sometimes after 25 years after TEI got started, it's important to remember that it was often first started really, the way the specs were written, what the authors had in mind was to record information about the original in a digital text. So in the early 90s, the challenge was, we have all these wonderful books, and now we want to have them in the computer, and there's a lot of information which we cannot pack into ASCII or Unicode. We have to add information to it by way of markup. And so how do we do this? It was basically a challenge of digitizing things. And that is still an important process, as we'll see in the Michael Fields project. You have a manuscript, and how do you translate that into the digital? But nevertheless, now many texts are actually created digitally, or they are already available digitally. And the challenge is to refine them and to change them into other formats. So one of the strengths of XML TEI, as it turned out to be, was that it is very useful as a master format for digital projects. So when we have a large-scale digital project, very often the user will never be exposed to XML TEI. We will create the XML TEI and then from there produce different outputs. And the input might not be a printed page or a handwritten page, but other things that we have found already done by our colleagues and then have already transformed into the kind of corpus that we would like to work with. So the really strong point of TEI is that it allows for making computable a limitless number of features in a text. With TEI, it is very intelligently designed, it is widely tested, and it is so adaptable that you can associate any kind of information with a digital text in a systematic fashion. So you can check whether what you're doing is consistent. If you work in a group where you have several encoders, you can sort of make sure minimum level of consistency is achieved by this kind of technology. I put to you that TEI thus is a means of sameness that sort of harnesses the ambiguity of the texts we are dealing with, which are inherently ambiguous. So now let me go to the second half of the talk. Now we look at some of the Chinese sources that I have been dealing with for a while now and how to tackle them with TEI. Imagine that 1,000 years ago, a monk wrote biographies of his fellow monks of the preceding 4 centuries, say. About 500 of them. He traveled to check out stone inscriptions, he read a lot of other books, he talked to people who have known those men, and then put together the Sung Dynasty collection of biographies of eminent monks. I'll want to talk about 3 dimensions of ambiguity that come up here. One is Chinese character variation, the other is places and place names, and the third is persons and their relationships. First, character variation. The Buddhist canon is extremely large, and it exists in Pali, in Chinese, in Tibetan, and we have also a lot of scriptures in Sanskrit. Now, this is the this is the Chinese Buddhist canon, and even of this Chinese Buddhist canon, there are a number of canonical editions over the last 1,000 years have happened. The most widely used edition is the Taisho edition. It's called Taisho edition because it was created in Japan in the reign period of the Taisho emperor. And it has 100 volumes. Yeah, but there are numerous others, earlier ones and also later ones in the 20th century. Now, this Taisho edition has the advantage that it already has a small apparatus at the bottom of the page, where the editors have collated the main text of the Taisho with that of some other editions. Okay? Let me show you how that looks like. If you don't read Chinese, don't get nervous now. I'll try to explain this very clearly. This is the main text, right? Chinese, we're reading it down here from top to bottom, right to left. Here, you have to believe me, this is a year, okay? This is a date. Here is a reference marker. From the distance, you can probably not see that it is a black circle with a 4, the Arabic numeral 4 written in it. And the 4 references this apparatus entry here. Okay? What's happening is that the character following this marker is referenced, and they say this character, and I think now you can see that these are the same characters, equals another character in, and here are two editions which are expressed by their sigla. Okay, so these are two different sigla, and we look at this character. This character is said to be another character in two other versions, okay? Now, this is all it says. This is all this particular apparatus says. It says, oh, I have two other versions, and there's a different character there. Now, we do not know, the editors do not make a recommendation, right? This is a purely descriptive edition. They do not say, well, actually like the second one, this one better, or actually no, this is right and the other two versions are wrong, right? In this case, it's possible to have a clear answer. The one in the annotation is just much better. This is the better character. This is the correct date. The difference it makes here is a different date, right? So an event is dated, and you get two different periods. So which is correct? And we know what is correct. This one is correct, and this one is sort of wrong. And how to do this in TEI? So what you can do in TEI here is you have an apparatus entry, and you say the lemma in the main text of the taisho is this character. And the taisho also kindly gives us two witnesses which have another character, right? And then since we're not sitting on our hands either, we have also found another two witnesses which also have this character. So this is what our project back then has added to this lemmata. So we're not just digitizing the canonical edition, we're also adding new information in a systematic fashion, right? So this is added by us. And then we can make a statement. We can say, well, actually, there is a whole range of different, a whole typology of how the text in the characters in the main text can relate to the characters in the apparatus. So we have to build a small ontology, a typology of what can happen, and then you can express this here. So I know that if I have an apparatus entry of type 1a, it means that the character in the main text is simply wrong, and you should go to check another character, right? So and there are a couple of 1b. So there are preferred readings and wrong readings, and there are unknown decisions. You can have either or. So there are different ways of expressing your interpretative take on what is happening there in the character variation. And you can do this here by using the analytic attribute within TEI. There are always other ways to do it in TEI, and that's fine, but this is one way to deal with this variation of characters. As a result, you get if you add this analytic markup to the apparatus, you can, for example, count mistakes, which is very interesting because we want to know how good our editions are, especially past editions, right? In this case, it turns out that the Sung collection of biographies of eminent monks in the Taisho canon contains about 3 mistakes per page. If that is a lot or not, depends on what you want to do with the text. If you want to translate it, presumably you would want to know about those mistakes. You can also use those to build better editions. And you can collect data on variants, which again can be used to build better search engines and. Place names. Buddhist monks, I don't know if you know that, but they moved about quite a bit. Wandering was, since the beginning of Buddhism in India, was seen as one of the things that monks do. So at a certain points in the year, monks would move about. And therefore, their biographies contain a lot of place names, especially historical place names, which are sometimes quite difficult to trace. So in such a situation, in addition to markup, in order to deal with those texts well, you need something of an authority database of place names. So you need to have an extra database or just a simple XML file of place names where you, for example, disambiguate Paris, France from Paris, Texas, right? The text says Paris, and you have to say, well, it's the one in France or it's one in Texas. Or you might want to say, sometimes places also have the uncanny habit of moving. A temple is first in one place and then it moves, is taken down and is moved to another place, and you might want to express that too. So what basically happened in that project is that we marked up all the person names, all the dates, And this is a place name here. And then the key element connects it to that database, right? So someone goes in there, he says, well, this is a place name, and now I'm checking in the authority database and say, oh, this is actually this place and not the other place, which is eponymous or so. And then I give it this ID number. And then you can do interesting things. You can, once you have marked up all the place names, person names, and dates in a text, you can have markup constructs. Either it doesn't matter where you put them, in the same file or in other files. Good thing about XML is that it allows for very distributed file structures. So the idea of the file has become much less important since we're using XML. And you can gather those information in what we call nexus points here. I mean, this is not a TEI term. This is something we call these things. In TEI, they are link groups. And there you can say that there was a person, this person and this other person was in that place at a certain time. Right? So by now you're already extracting information and recording that information still in TEI as part of the text. And what you do is you create little factoids, little information driblets, which can be collected and then worked on. And one of the way to work on that is, so this is another thing. So, okay, so we have person, place, person, and then someone reads that, and by reading and understanding it, then they can express their understanding in a very formalized way with TEI like this. Okay? And then when you have that, then you can build applications on top of that. You can then, for example, have an interface where you have a map, and you can sort of separate a piece of the map and say, I'm interested in the lower Yangtze region, and then then you can have times, because there's a time element there too, right? So you can have in a certain place, in a certain time, what happened according to those biographies. Okay? And then you can sort of make little movies, because then you can take the data, right, and you can come up with new visualizations, and suddenly these biographies, which are fairly difficult to read and fairly difficult to remember what you've read once you've finished reading it, you can actually utilize. So up here is a timeline. This is sort of the history of Chinese Buddhism according to this text, and we are at the year 156 now, CE, and you see that there are the first beginnings of Chinese Buddhism here in the Chang'an region and down here, up here. And then when we continue now, we have 200, and there is another dot here where Nanjing is. And then we continue, and suddenly they become more. And there is there was a shift there, right? Around the year 300, suddenly we see more activity in China. Utaishan comes into play here, somewhere, and here, and then Luoyang comes into play. And it continues like that, following trade routes, following communication lines. You can also see how Buddhism enters China. You see here is this Taklamakan desert. This is the silk routes, right? The silk routes come up here, the northern silk route, the southern silk route, and they enter here in Dunhuang, Lanzhou, and then they come into China. (400) BCE. Now Chang'an becomes clear as the center of Chinese Buddhism. Luoyang is here, Nanjing is getting more busy. 500, 600, and suddenly a lot of things happen in India. This is mainly due to the journey of one famous monk, Xuanzang, who recorded a lot of Indian places in his travelogue to India. So suddenly we learned about Indian geography as well. Right? So partly this can be used as a research tool to discover research questions and focusing on certain regions and certain time periods. Another thing is that it can be used for teaching. So if I have a class on Chinese Buddhism, then I can show them this, and then they can sort of remember. students can remember where Buddhism came in first, and that there was something happening in the south as well, and which were centers of Buddhism and which were sort of regions where Buddhism was not very present. Now let's look at the bibliographic information. You remember that we've pulled information with TEI together in this form, right? You had people, places, and time. Now, the way these biographies work is that if two people were at the same place at the same time, then they probably knew each other. They've probably met, they have interacted in some way. And it might be 3 people or 5 people or 7 people who have worked together on a translation, say. And then we thought, why don't we output social network information from that? Because with social network analysis, you can do different things. You can ask, again, different questions, which is not related to geography. And look and behold, there is Chinese Buddhist history in 6,000 actors and 13,000 connections. It looks better with the lights down, but anyway. Here it is in black and white. And then you can look at the whole data set and discover different forms of data bias. For example, you can check out, actually a very small part of the data is from the 2nd millennium. And all these other monks here are, this is the information we have on the 1st millennium. So you explore your data set, you explore, see what kind of data you have. And anyway, this is it. Chinese Buddhist history. But what does it look like? Since when is Buddhist history a caterpillar? Well, you have to zoom in, and now we're looking at sort of this part of the network, which is a relatively early part. There's a lot of things happening here in the Sui dynasty. Here is the Tang dynasty, and then our information thins out. This is the first emperor of the Song down here, and this now we're entering sort of Ming and early Qing territory over here. So if we zoom in and look only at the network of actors who died between 340 and 570, we can, for example, observe sort of a difference in governance. The red dots are members, are actors from the Liu clan, who were the rulers of the Liu Song dynasty, which ruled China for the better part of the 5th century. Actually, it was the worst part because it was constant slaughter and killing, and there were a terrible bunch of people. But then, as time continues, the Liu sort of pass out, and then the Xiao clan takes over, and you have important. And this is actually a famous emperor here who was very important for Buddhism and for the spread of Buddhism in China. And before that, in the early 5th century, you have this group of 3 seemingly very important and influential people. And those are Daoan, Huiyuan, and Kumarajiva. And these 3 figures are really very important for the history of Chinese Buddhism because they were all involved in the large-scale translation of Buddhist scriptures. Okay, so if you didn't have these 3 people, the history of Chinese Buddhism would look very, very different. Especially Kumarajiva was an important figure. He has produced many, many texts who today still are used as they were translated around 400 by Chinese Buddhists. So if you go to a Chinese monastery or have any ritual of Chinese Buddhism, you might come across a text that was translated by Kumarajiva, who is here. Now this is Huiyuan, this is Kumarajiva. Huiyuan was Daoan's student, and you can see that their connection is a little stronger. So we have more evidence in the text that they were connected, that they had something to do with each other. There's a very thin line that leads from Daoan to Kumarajiva because they have never met. And the reason why this line is there is because at one point Daoan is mentioned to have said something about Kumarajiva. And the encoders picked up on that. And so they were not in the same, this is now going beyond same place, same time, nexus points. This is a nexus point which draws people together. And again, a borderline ambiguity here. Should you do this? Is this something which you should record, right? This is up to you how you encode the text. Huiyuan and Kumarajiva had correspondence, and that is why there is a red line connecting them. So they were actually communicating. This kind of communication should be marked up, probably. And you can see sort of certain cliques. So this is the clique of Huiyuan students. Here you have the people who helped Kumarajiva, either important donors or patrons or helpers in his translations. And here is Daoan, who has assembled quite an impressive clique of students too. So now you can, if you have smaller networks like that, one of the questions you can easily ask with social network analysis is, for example, who knew all these three players? Okay, who of these many small actors actually was in touch with all of the three? Because presumably those people would be also interesting for the history. If you write a history of Chinese Buddhism at the time, you would want to know who actually had connections with all of them. Turns out there are only three. There are Tanyong, Huichi, and Fahe, all of them fairly unknown people. So if you would study, you could study Chinese Buddhism for a long time and you would never hear of these people because they are not famous. But presumably they did play a relatively important role in the communication network of the time. So what's the next step from here? Well, one thing is, again, you can build dynamic networks now. You can actually have a timeline here. The time slider is down here, and we're looking at 50 years, and this is 250, 300, 400, and then you'll see how first Daoan comes up, being based in Chang'an. First, a couple of the minor characters. This is Daoan now, and he connects with his students. He builds a clique of people helping him, and then here's Huiyuan, here's his student Huiyuan who is working with him, and then later he sends him away, and Huiyuan goes to Mount Lu, becomes more independent. On the other side, then Kumarajiva appears in Central Asia. He comes from India to Central Asia, and meets different people on his way there, and is captured by different people. And then while Huiyuan builds up his network around Mount Lu, Kumarajiva goes to Chang'an and intensifies his network there, and then at one point Daoan must die. Daoan is dead, and then people pass out of that picture, and in the end Huiyuan and Kumarajiva sort of vanish, as we all will. Just in case you forgot. Very good. I think this is all I wanted to say for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for a really fascinating talk. We have some time for some questions, if you're happy to take questions. The questions might come from Philadelphia, they might come from here. But let me open it up to our audience here for anything you'd like to ask Marcus.
I'm just actually curious what resource you're using for the place names, what your database for the place names for this Chinese Buddhist project was.
Right. To get started, we collaborated with the Academia Sinica in Taipei, who have built a place name of cities in Chinese history, because cities also move their coordinates from time to time, and that helped a lot. And then we added 10 or 20,000 places, mainly temples, because many on a smaller scale temple names or mountain names or so, or smaller cities, sort of we had to contribute it ourselves. We had to do this ourselves. So the database as it is now, and you can download this. The part that we have done is available for download. And it's still being worked on because there are still other projects going on with those authority databases. So at that time, the idea was to have central authority databases for different projects. You would have a person authority database for Chinese Buddhists, and a place authority database, and a time authority database where you would map all East Asian calendars to. And those would sort of sit in the middle, and then there would be different projects around that. And that has worked fairly well.
I gather from the way you've presented this, that not much is known about the actual entities in question, aside from the fact that they existed. That is to say, you know, you don't necessarily have the basis for building a kind of more elaborate picture of what these people were as, you know, as humans. But is there anything that you can capture from the text, or that you are already capturing from the texts, concerning things like birthplace or, you know, education? In other words, things about these monks as people that might provide an additional layer of complexity in understanding sort of their interactions and their role and their influence and stuff like that?
No, we know what is assumed as their birthplace or birth region. Though in Chinese this can also sometimes mean the clan-based birthplace. So that's not necessarily the real birthplace. It's more of like, okay, I'm coming from a clan which has their main graves in a certain region. So we know that, and we have tried to map that at one point. And we know another important dimension which we haven't captured or is not part of this particular project is texts, what texts they wrote and how they communicated with texts. That is another dimension about which we know a lot. What we do not, I mean, we have actually, compared to Europe or compared to India, we have a lot of information. We have much more information about religious actors in China in the first millennium than we have in Europe. Much more. It's due to the nature of Chinese historiography. It just turns out to be that Chinese historiography has always been a very self-conscious and very intensely practiced craft, and this is history has been handled very differently in India and also in Europe.
Thank you for the great talk. I have a question about this ambiguity, and I really appreciate the way in which you approach the question of, say, the executional, if you like, you know, sort of the disambiguation on the level of really encoding, on the one hand, and on the other hand, certain kind of hermeneutical attention to the ambiguity of the text that is required in the very act of encoding. And so those two dimensions were very well, I thought, captured in your presentation too, right? Because you want to show how they too really should go together and do go together in the actual coding. And so within that kind of analytic paradigm, I was also interested in what you said about the function of the TEI as a kind of master, master format that harnesses, right, the ambiguity of the original text. And so that was really striking, right, to think about the leaving the ambiguity of the text as it is, as an act of mastering, right? And so this is a question that really kind of resonate with me. I come out of sort of more textual background. And so I was very interested in, and I sort of missed a little bit of detail about the Tang Song, you know, that difference in Taisho, right, the addition of the text. And so, so what I understood from your example is that the footnote was showing that this particular word, the character, right, that's the first ambiguity, right, had a sort of different typographies, right, in Tang and Song, and so it showed a difference. That was what was said in the footnote, right? Addition, right.
Partly the editions were done at different times.
I see. So that was just basically. So when I read you know, from your footnote, you know, so it's an indexical kind of, you know, warning.
Yes.
So there are just differences.
Yes.
So when I read it, it seems more like a kind of vagueness rather than ambiguity. Right? It just seems to say they're different, but it doesn't say exactly what it is.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. It just says it's different.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of really interesting, as you were saying, there is a kind of attention to that detail, really preserve the additional editorial, if you like, attention as shown in that text. But what I couldn't quite get was how the TEI itself can further harness the ambiguity part. And so that's the part that I just didn't quite, I don't know the details well enough to know exactly what could be an example within that, right? Because as I read it, This is an amazing, example of certain what I see as more like a vagueness in sort of general kind of also Chinese sort of classical text. And so I don't mean to sort of somehow try and disambiguate the difference between vagueness and ambiguity itself, but it's that there is a kind of a fascinating room for further analysis, right, of the exact function of the TEI in the mastering of the text. And if you can just say something more about the particular part in reference to your point on this sort of why TEI, and also, I mean, I think that goes back to what I find so interesting about Maria's point about querying, right? It's leaving that somehow empty, but also functional, but maybe it's up to the reader rather than actual decoder. I don't know what it is. So if the question makes sense, I just want to leave it as an open-ended. Yeah.
The good thing about TEI is that you can have your cake and eat it, in the sense that you can record very closely what is there in the original, but you can also make decisions, add it, your interpretation, more or less clear-cut, and then you can decide what to foreground and what not. So you have seen, Marion gave this very it's really an exemplary project, the Goodwin Shelley project. You can provide things for the reader where the reader can look at both, at only Mary Shelley's writing, or you can have her husband's addition to it, right? At that time she wasn't Shelley yet. So the idea is to separate the encoding from the way people can interact with it, and thereby giving people options, right? You can say, okay, I have encoded that. I think that between those two characters, one is correct and the other is wrong, and I say that way. But that doesn't mean that the wrong one gets deleted. That's the good thing, and that is in a way it opens up new ways for editing, because the traditional approach to best editions is often to sort of, you have a best edition and then you have several witnesses, and you cannot, in a traditional editing world, in a print world, you cannot record them all. It's just not possible. But if the text is digital, then you have a better shot at actually providing lots of different readings and then making a recommendation. And then assembling the text on your screen as you like it. This doesn't work with print. With print, you have to settle on one main text. I have to make a decision. What do I put in the main text of the printed page? And then the others get sort of demoted into the apparatus. And with digital editing, when it comes to character variants and apparata, then you can really, to a degree, leave it to the user if you build that kind of interface.
I really enjoyed the network visualizations you had at the end of your presentation. I'm wondering what software you use to make the dynamic maps and the sort of static network visualizations. Geffi. I mean, there are a number of ways to do this. Geffi has been very popular in the digital humanities the last couple of years, because it is you can use it and it's relatively easy to use. If you use Pajek or so, then you have to do more programming, more command line things. With Geffi, the only problem is getting the data right. So when you're able to get the data in good shape, then Geffi will do the visualization for you, and you don't have to do much extra programming. That packs a lot of power for what it does. It's an open source free project, so it's very nice to use. I can recommend it on that level. The maps I use, now I use QGIS, and the ones you saw were usually in the browser it's a KML output from what we do, so,
Yeah, okay, this is George Hong from Fordham University, and very impressive with your wonderful presentation. I just wondering if you know another term or discipline, so-called spatial study.
Yes.
This is what our team is working in the past 10 years. We received a big grant from Henry Luce Foundation to visualize Chinese religious sites since Tang Dynasty in the past 1,500 years. We already published 11 articles regarding this one. When you focus on the encoding text or whatever, our team is developing visualization and the mapping of the Chinese 5 main religious research sites, including Buddhism, Catholic, Protestant, Islamic, and Taoism. So now my question is, when you show this map, I just wondering if you can address specific issues such as shortage of temple.
Yes.
In Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty.
Yes.
In doing so, you can find the 2 specific data. Number one, believers, Buddhists, which representing demanding. Then temple, which represent supply. Then once you get the latitude and altitude of this kind of specific location of a church or a temple, you can figure out how long each Buddhist must take to reach Near East temple. If you can do that, you can find out, okay, we also develop our criteria, how long should be reasonable, and how far, how many miles or kilometers will be reasonable. If you can address this one, that will be fascinating the collaboration with us. The reason we don't need this coding because we rely on the particular, after 1911, Chinese government already released very specific data, number of 5 major religious sites. And then based on our empirical study to verify this kind of data, finally we can use this data, which means we already take care, the government already take care of encoding or whatever text stuff. We don't have to use historical text. But what we should use is using GIS instead of a GIF. GIF is good for teaching purpose. Are you using GIS, Geographic Information System?
Yes.
That would be very, but you didn't show it here. Hopefully we can, I really encourage you to move another dimension, so-called spatial study of a Chinese religious church. That would be another fascinating area. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Zhou-Yang, I think I read your article and it's good to see you now. Finally,
I just came from Purdue, so that's why we had the team at the Purdue, and then very fortunate to receive
Fang Laoshi.
Yang Fenggang. I'm Hong Zhaohui. So you know.
Good to see you.
This is really a question that I thought of when Peter was speaking, but it strikes me as something that you two might be able to talk about together. Peter, you said when you were describing your encoding of the encyclopedia that you were interested in studying the potential increasing complexity of language on the assumption that as the complexity of scientific knowledge increases, the complexity of language necessary to talk about it would also necessarily increase. And I started to think about what kinds of complexity you might be talking about. In other words, is it just that we need more complex syntax in the sentences, or is it that there needs to be greater differentiation of concepts through increasingly precise vocabulary, or is it about the complexity of rhetorical patterns in the encyclopedia? In other words, that there needs to be more sort of deployment of explanatory backstory and all the rest of it, or maybe these are ands and not ors, or is there more sort of cultural context or assumed prerequisite knowledge that the reader has to kind of amass before he or she can actually digest the article, etc. Anyway, so I'm thinking about complexity in writing, and then it suddenly occurred to me that I'd been thinking essentially the same kinds of thoughts about queerness in writing. In other words, or queerness in encoding. And wondering where we look, at what layer of the meaning system do we look for phenomena like queerness or complexity? And I have no idea if these two ideas are in fact as parallel as my question is sort of as a gambit suggesting that they might be. But I wonder if this is something, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the complexity side of things, but Marcus, I wonder whether this rings any bells with you as far as the markup side of things.
Right. Well, methodologically, it rings a bell in the sense that this is another area, I think, where humanists can learn from computer science, because computer science has a lot to say about measuring of complexity. And I think this is where your question is driving at. Getting into social network analysis, I learned really interesting things, which sociologists probably knew anyway. I mean, it's not a big deal. But for me, as a scholar of Chinese Buddhism, this was really new. That how to measure centrality in a network, what node is central, right? And it turns out that sociologists, social network analysts have come out with a number of wonderful centrality measures, which all measure slightly different facets of centrality. And as a humanist, I thought that was really enlightening because it made me think about the concept of centrality in very different parameters. And I think something similar might happen with complexity. If you start reading about complexity theory in computer science, information theory, then our texts will might open up in unexpected ways.
I'll just add to that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about complexity. Let's just say some ways are more complex than others. And the simplest way of thinking about complexity, since we are just beginning this project, I'm focused on the simplest way of thinking about it. And the simplest way right now is simply, does the language itself grow more complex in the sense of, does it develop an increased linguistic density? Does it have new terms? And are more of the terms that are used unique than they were earlier? In other words, what's the ratio of all the words used versus the number of unique words? It's called the type to token ratio. And, you know, a children's book can have a very low type to token ratio because it repeats words. We hope it repeats words, right? As that ratio changes, it means that the language is getting increasingly dense with a larger vocabulary. And so we're just going to measure that as a starting point to get a sense for whether or not the language grows denser over time. So that would be the simplest approach to complexity, and then everything else is going to have to build off of that.
I can come back to the question about ambiguity, disambiguation, and where you started, Marcus, which was really that sense of, well, a binary system either is or isn't. There's this really interesting tension underlying so much of the work we do as literary scholars, as humanities scholars, between a system fundamentally premised on making very stark binary choices and the kind of realm of ambiguity in which many of the questions that we as humanists study, that realm in which we thrive. And I'm increasingly interested in what happens if we focus on visualizing our uncertainty. You very nicely talked in response to that question about, well, digital editions preserve the right not to have to choose. Digital editions enable you, in a way unlike print editions, to retain all of these things in play. We have to tag them, we have to do that interpretative work, we have to say what they are, but we don't have to push them to the side. They can remain part of the texture of the edition. And I think that that's absolutely one of the great things about working in the digital environment when we're working as editors. But I'm also wondering about the potential for really tagging uncertainty, the potential for really flagging up where we don't know instead of, or even at the same time as, that we make a choice. And then what happens if we map that uncertainty? What do we learn through confronting our uncertainty more than from confronting our certainty, the areas of our certainty? And is there a particular potential, this is one thing that really fascinates me, is there a particular potential within text encoding, within the kinds of resources that we're talking about for confronting our uncertainties, but taking that almost as our primary object of study? What does our uncertainty tell us about our scholarly methods, our own perspective, the kinds of data we're working with, and what would it look like to visualize that uncertainty, and how would it, so just in relation to the kinds of projects you've been showing us, if you were able to, and if you tagged in such a way as to really make the areas of uncertainty the primary object of study, what could that potentially tell you about the methods, your data, the kind of analyses you're performing? And where might that take us? I know that's an incredibly speculative question, but I'm really fascinated. I think that possibility has been lurking behind a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And I wonder if you can say a little bit about where that might take us.
In the past, and I think, Julia, you might remember those in the TEI list, there were debates about, there's a sort of an attribute in TEI, cert, right? Cert attribute where you can record how sure you are of this particular encoding. So you can say 80%, for example, or 20% or so. But there was a certain discomfort with that, and in the debates, then people weighed in and they said, well, again, in computer science you have precision, and precision is again defined in very formal ways, and you know exactly sort of what precision is in a given context. With uncertainty, I think we reach the limits of markup. I think then probably markup is not the best tool to deal with that because of the particular emotional quality that we mean when we say uncertainty. When you say uncertain about an interpretation, that might change even from day to day, right? This is so ephemeral and so personal and so, it's such an emotional timbre that it's very hard to use markup to encode that in a meaningful fashion so that other people can use that. Because by the time you have encoded that, you might feel already very different about it. And because you have read on and what was unsure before has become now a certainty because you have found evidence. So I think that is probably out of the feeling part of uncertainty is probably outside of the purview of markup. There are other issues involved around precision or so, which is really important. And one thing where markup has helped me settling uncertainties was often in connection with consistency. When we edit text with markup, we are forced to consistency in a much higher way than we didn't. And that throws up all kinds of questions which would otherwise have been invisible. So the pulling out into visibility of certain issues surrounding how titles are structured, connected to author bylines or so. These things in a text, become aware of those things is partly because markup forces you to address those questions and sort of make a decision where you don't really, before you didn't want to make a decision and you didn't feel you needed to make a decision, but markup sort of pushes you and said, yes, disambiguate, say yes or no here. There are ways to flag these moments in markup where you say, well, actually I'm not sure here, but in the end, I never felt they were very satisfying. That was not the best part of TEI, the cert attribute.
And I love the fact that even when we're uncertain, we're forced to be very certain about the level of our uncertainty. I remember the first time I used that tag and think, what, now I have to say exactly what percentage of uncertain I am? I mean, I'm just uncertain. You know, there's something really interesting about the tensions, I think, that we run up against between these two areas of study. But I like what you're saying really is that, well, all of these processes that we're really putting in place in order to enable a more distant reading actually force us, first of all, to do a more close reading. And we're forced to attend to things because we have to make these choices. We're forced to attend to things we otherwise may not have attended to or may not have attended to closely enough in order to interrogate exactly which of those routes we would take, which of those choices we would make. And that seems like it's another very interesting element of what you're doing in this project and the way that you're approaching these things.
That's it.
We are just about to head for lunch, but are there any other questions? Actually, I have a question for everybody here. This is one thing that's just been fascinating me. Who uses the choice tag in TEI and how do they use it? This is partly following on from this idea of uncertainty, and I keep wanting to use the choice tag. I always think I'm not using it for the purposes I should be using it. I'm really fascinated. Do you want to say, Marcus, a little bit, actually, do you want to say something about the choice tag first and then say how you use it?
Yes, why not? I'm always pro-choice. Because the choice tag was introduced partly to get rid of an awkward situation where you had to encode certain facets as attributes instead of elements. So when you wanted to say that there was a deletion in a place and something has been added above it for that, then you could say delete and then have an add attribute with the addition in it.
But then sometimes the additions would become very long and cumbersome, and then you wanted to have perhaps an add and then with a deletion element. But all this didn't really work, so it had to be on the same level. So you had an addition and a delete as elements, but then you wanted to group them together because they still represent the same chunk of text. So that was on a technical level, that why the choice tag was used in the end. I think it was P5 or so, where these things came together and they just said, and correct me if I remember that wrong, but I think this was one of the reasons. Choice was for several things that before you could choose to express in an attribute, you now have two independent elements and grouped by choice. And it's just something which is used very, very often in all kinds of editorial interventions, additions, deletions, corrections, changes, omissions, damage, gaps. You often have for example, there's a damaged version, which results in a gap in the text. But I have another version of the text, so I actually know what the text is supposed to say. So I want to include that in the encoding. So I have a construct which goes something like choice, and then there is a gap, and there is 5 lines of text which I grab from somewhere else, and I will say, well, I added that. That's my addition, responsibility, MB or whatever. And then in the output, you can, however you deal with the text, you can decide to search the complete text, or you can search only the text which was damaged, or you can represent it online or as in a PDF or in any way you like. But the fact that I know what the burned page was meant to say, or I presume to know from another edition, can be recorded, and somehow the choice is just a useful way to put this together. No? Please.
I can embroider on that just a little bit. I think your account of the genesis of choice is exactly right, except that the children, the elements that it's supposed to have in it don't include the ones that you're talking about.
Right.
But that seems like a legitimate use of choice. In other words, if the goal of choice is to enable the management of textual multiplicity, I think the things that the TEI sort of by default includes there are things like abbreviations or original spelling, stuff like that. But it seems like extending it in the direction that you're talking about to include places of textual uncertainty makes a lot of sense. And in fact, unclear is one of the possible children of choice, where I guess you could tuck in things like damage and gap and stuff like that. And just to add to what you were saying, I think one of the most interesting uses of choice that I've come across in our own practice at the Women Writers Project has been working with the editors of a manuscript, big baggy manuscript thing. And it basically is a way for them to manage their debates as a team, right? In other words, that as editors, they're working collaboratively on this very undecidable manuscript. And when they come to a place where there might be many possible ways of elucidating a vagueness or a genuinely undecidable word or transcription, they can put as many unclears inside choice as they want and can associate certainty with those as a way of sort of suggesting the level of hunchiness that they have about these things. And it's an interesting footnote on the TEI cert element, our cert attribute, which Marcus pointed out, that in fact, originally there was a kind of percentage system when the attribute was introduced, and in fact it was found unworkable for exactly the reasons you give, because the idea of being very precise about something as subjective or intersubjective as uncertainty was really untenable. So I think they now have gone to something like a high, medium, low, which is sort of, okay, we can imagine having that level of precision about uncertainty. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's more realistic than, 67%. Definitely today, 67%, which is the thing that was sort of mind-blowing for me when I first came to work with that. But yeah, this is great, because I think it's really interesting the ways that TEI, the ways that XML can preserve the instability, rather than just flatten it out. The criticisms that have been made about text encoding, the criticisms that have been made over the years, very interestingly, about these kinds of practices, that they will just flatten out the real core of what we're sometimes interested in. Certainly, I'm speaking of myself as a literary scholar, of where things are ambiguous, where things are unstable. I'm really interested in probing these points in the TEI sort of toolkit, where actually it allows that to come to the fore much more than it would in any other kind of edition. But Marcus, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking talk.